Continuing our reaction series to Mike Winger's Divorce and Remarriage teaching. This will be easier if you go back to the first episode. So I'm going to have a link to a playlist in the description below. I would click on that if you haven't seen the first episodes before this, and then watch those. And then once you get to this episode, it'll make a whole lot more sense. So also subscribe to make sure you get this content going forward, and let's go for it.
Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7. Now we're going to dig into a new section, Paul's teaching on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is a hotly debated chapter, and it's long and it gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to try to make it as succinct as I can, which will be not terribly succinct, because this video is meant to be the exhaustive teaching. If you want the short teaching, there'll be another video in the description that'll be the short one. 1 Corinthians 7. Verses 10 through 16 in particular, that's what we're going to cruise through right now. It says, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord." That means he's quoting Jesus, or referring to Jesus' teaching. "The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife." Now, when we say these words separate, and then divorce down here, what are we talking about? Well, in the Roman world, it was the same thing. In their Roman Greek context, if you separated, like if you physically left your spouse, that was a divorce. You could divorce without a certificate. You could divorce unilaterally. One man or woman, either one could just leave, or if you owned the house, you kick them out, and that's the end of the marriage.
Okay, so I agree with Mike's assessment that under Roman law, when Paul says separate, he means what we would think of today as a divorce. Today, we distinguish between separation and divorce, but under the Roman law there, they didn't really do that. So today, if you have a husband who lives in New York and a wife who lives in Los Angeles, they can legally be still married under our current law in the United States. But under Roman law, not so much, because they're separated, so they wouldn't be married anymore. That's my understanding of how Roman law worked, and so I think Mike is correct about that. So we differentiate between separation and divorce in our custom and our law and our kind of normal understanding, but under Roman law, they didn't do that. Separation and divorce were kind of the same thing.
So when Paul says you shouldn't separate from your husband, he's saying divorce. He's saying you leave, you end the marriage by leaving, and he says you shouldn't do this. It actually seems like this might have been fairly common at the time. And here's one quote from the time, from the 1st century AD, a funeral inscription which said, "Uncommon are marriages which last so long, brought to an end by death, not broken apart by divorce. For it was our happy lot that it should be prolonged to the 41st year without estrangement." So they're rejoicing in how long their marriage lasted. Seneca, who was a 1st century philosopher, he complained that in his Greek world, that Greek and Roman, I mean, they had Greek culture, but they were Romans. He complained that there are women who do not number their years by consuls, but by husbands. They divorce to marry, and they marry to divorce. So we don't know exactly how common it was, but it's a complaint, and it comes from different sources in the 1st century that it seems like it was a pretty common thing. And when Paul writes to the Corinthians in particular, they're in a situation where it seems like they're divorcing because they think it's more spiritual to be single, and to not have any kind of relations physically. And this is asceticism creeping its way.
Okay, so I agree with Mike's point here that these Corinthians that Paul is writing to are looking for reasons to divorce so that they can be single. And now this is important later. The context is that Paul doesn't want them to remarry, and they don't want to remarry. No one is looking for remarriage. So when Mike later finds an ability to remarry in verse 15, he thinks he sees that ability to remarry in verse 15. I disagree with that. We'll talk about it in a minute. But when he finds that in verse 15, through what he reads as like an implication from the verse, reading that as an implication doesn't make a lot of sense because it goes against the whole context. Nobody's looking for remarriage. So it would just be kind of odd to say, oh, Paul says, congratulations, now you can get remarried. They look at him like, what do you mean? Congratulate? Like, we don't want to be remarried. You don't want us to remarry. We don't want to be remarried. Why would we think then Paul is giving them an implication like, oh, you can go ahead and be remarried? And this is really important because the Corinthians are reading this through the eyes of people who want to be celibate. They want to be celibate. And today, often when we look at this passage, we're looking at it thinking, because of the interpretations that we have in Protestantism, we're looking at it thinking, oh, is there a right to remarry here? And so we're coming at it from like the wrong context. We're coming at it from a assumed perhaps right to be able to remarry, and the Corinthians don't want remarriage. So that's a contextual problem that we have today when we look at verse 15. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, before we continue, it's a good moment actually to pause and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Notice that in verse 8, Paul starts the section to the widows and widowers. Verse 10, Paul starts a section to the married. And then in verse 25, Paul starts a section to the betrothed. Okay, so you have widows and widowers. It's going in reverse chronological order. Widows and widowers, married, betrothed, right? And that's verse 8, verse 10, verse 25. All right, now, also look at verse 12. Paul writes, to the rest. Okay, now that phrase is a big deal, and we'll see that soon. But that phrase is not a new demographic group. Like, how would you know who the rest are? So rather, Paul there is referring to the rest of their questions, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's still talking to the married after verse 12. So the structure of the passage, widows and widowers, then married, then betrothed, is a very important context to understand what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7.
Way into the church, and Paul's like, no, don't do that. You're married, stay married. Like, don't separate from your husband. And if you do, get reconciled. And the same goes for the husband. So verses 10 through 11, this is about a theoretical marriage where both are Christians. Let me be clear. Paul's giving advice to Christians. He's saying, Christians, here's your rule. Don't cause divorce. That's the rule. It's active in both cases. The wife.
Okay, here I disagree with Mike. He says that 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11 only apply when both spouses are Christians. That is incorrect. That applies whether one or both spouses are believers. If one's a believer, one's an unbeliever, or they're both believers, or they're both unbelievers, these verses apply to everybody. Now, where does he get this idea that it would be narrowed to only Christians? Because nothing in the text says that. If you have a text that says, don't steal, we don't go, oh, well, they're writing to Christians, so only Christians shouldn't steal, but non-believers, they can steal. That's okay for them to do. But believers need to not steal. No, we don't say that. Or if it says, honor your parents, right? Well, that's for everybody. Some children in the church aren't saved yet, but it still says honor your parents regardless of their salvation status. We say that the moral law applies to everybody. Otherwise, non-Christians would not be able to sin because the law would only apply to Christians. Nobody thinks that. Okay, so where he gets it from is actually the next verse. There's a phrase in the next verse, verse 12, that says, to the rest. When Paul writes to the rest, he's not writing to a new demographic group. Rather, what he's doing is to the rest of the questions you asked. So the idea is that in verse 10 and 11, Paul is paraphrasing Jesus' teaching. He's saying, here's what Jesus taught in different words than what we see in the Gospels, but this is still a accurate, representative summation. Here's like the rule that you would derive from Jesus' teaching. If you're divorced, be single or be reconciled to your spouse. Those are your options. So that's verses 10 and 11. Then verse 12, he says, to the rest, he says, I say, I, not the Lord. And what that phrase means is, I'm now responding to questions you asked that Jesus did not specifically address. Paul is not saying Jesus' teaching does not pertain to believer, non-believer marriages. He's not saying that. All he's saying is, you guys asked some specific questions. I'm gonna respond to those, but I just want you to be clear, Jesus didn't actually address this in his earthly ministry. He's just putting bookends. He's just saying in verse 10, I'm going to summarize what Jesus said. And then in verse 12, in the beginning of it, he's saying, okay, I'm done summarizing what Jesus specifically said. And now I'm going to go on to your questions, to the rest of your questions that Jesus did not specifically respond to. But what is this question from the Corinthians that Paul is responding to that Jesus never had occasion to address? And it's probably something like a question like this. Well, if I'm a believer and I'm married to an unbeliever, I'm supposed to be the temple of the Holy Spirit, but they're the daughter of a strange God, as some of the prophets write. So wouldn't that be sacrilege for us to come together and be intimate? Isn't that sacrilegious? And so that's a very kind of interesting, smart kind of question. And then Paul, you can see the way he responds to this. He says, well, the unbeliever is sanctified by the believer, so don't worry about it, is what he tells us later on. But you can understand why somebody thinking this through might come up with that question before they learn what Paul writes there later in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. They're just trying to understand how all of this works. So they might think, oh, I guess we have to divorce our unbelieving spouse. So that might be the question they were asking, and then Paul is responding to that. You'll notice if you look through the Gospels, that's not a question that Jesus gets, so it's not a question that Jesus has occasion to respond to, but Paul is here responding to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. That is not the same as saying Jesus never talked about believer-unbeliever marriages. That's not what that means. That just means there's a specific question that Jesus didn't have occasion to respond to. So now here's the interpretive kind of gymnastics that Mike's going to do, and this is not only Mike. A lot of people do this in evangelicalism. It's common, and so here's how it's going to work. So first, the prohibition on divorce and remarriage in verses 10 and 11, they'll say those are only for believer-believer marriages, right? They're both believers. So that's the first part. Now, if that was true, then we have a problem, because nothing that Jesus said indicated that his teaching was only for believer-believer marriages. Jesus taught the Pharisees who were not saved. How do we know they were not saved? They came there to test him. Jesus said that they had hard hearts in Matthew 19:8. These are not saved people who came to challenge Jesus' view on divorce and remarriage. So he's telling it to them as like, this is the rule you guys are supposed to be following. And they're non-believers. Therefore, Jesus' teaching is for believers and non-believers, for everybody, just like all the other teachings and moral imperatives that we have in the scripture. Additionally, Jesus bases his whole teaching about this on creation. Creation means everybody. Believers, non-believers, everybody is a son or daughter of Adam and Eve. So it belongs to everybody because it's based on creation. So that's the other problem with this. I mean, there's no way, if you look back at what Jesus said in Matthew 5, in Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 16, 18, there's nothing in the context that would tell the people at the time that Jesus is speaking to, oh, by the way, this is only for if two believers are married. There's no way his audience could have known that, because that's not what he was saying. So it's against the context to narrow verses 10 and 11 of 1 Corinthians 7 to only believer-believer marriages. Okay, second, Mike will say that verse 12 and following create a different set of rules for marriages between a believer and a non-believer. Now, I think that's wrong, and we'll talk about that some more. Third, Mike will claim verse 15 allows a believer to remarry after an unbeliever separates. Now, I think that's a wrong interpretation of verse 15. We'll talk about that. Fourth, keep going, Mike will claim that if two believers are married and one separates, the one who's separated can be treated as though they were an unbeliever, and then the abandoned believer can remarry. So in this way, Mike and most evangelicals start with a distinction between believer-believer marriages, believer-unbeliever marriages, but then when they get down to verse 15, it doesn't really matter who was a believer and who wasn't. And so all that matters is who was abandoned and who wasn't. So the only point then of making this claim that verses 10 and 11 pertain to believer-believer marriages is to narrow Jesus' teaching in the Gospels to marriages where both spouses are acting like believers. The rule ends up being, regardless of who claims to be a believer, if your spouse cheats on you or abandons you, you can divorce and you can remarry. So now here's the thing. They get all of that from the phrase to the rest in verse 12. And so they use to the rest in verse 12 to make Jesus' teaching effectively inapplicable, because the main thing that you get from Jesus' teaching, even if you thought the exception clause allows somebody to divorce and remarry for adultery, let's just stipulate, that's not my view. I think the exception clause is talking about an invalid marriage. We'll leave that to the side. Let's just say Jesus' exception clause allowed somebody to divorce and remarry for adultery. Well, that means then that's the only case in which somebody can divorce and remarry would then be for adultery, right? That means all other cases are excluded. So they have to find a way to kind of remove Jesus' rejection of divorce and remarriage for other reasons. They have to find a way to remove that. And the way they do that is through this phrase, to the rest, in verse 12. And that is just, there's no way that phrase can hold the weight of this whole kind of system that they have there. The much more simple way of understanding it is that the rest of what Paul is teaching here is just stuff that Jesus didn't specifically have occasion to respond to, not that verses 10 and 11 are only believer-believer marriages.
Is the one causing it, should not separate, and then the husband's the one causing it, should not divorce his wife. So don't cause divorce. It's no mention here of what to do if the other spouse leaves you. There's no advice to what if you were the one that was left. Paul doesn't mention that. He will come to that later. In a Christian marriage, you just want to keep it together. I mean, that's the bottom line. So it seems to assume that they're going to listen. Paul just assumes that Christians are going to hear him and hear Jesus on this topic, that they're going to follow through, that they're going to come back to their spouse. There's an assumption there. Now, what if they don't listen? What if your spouse left you and the instruction is for them to come back, but they don't listen? What do you do then? We'll come to that later. This is based on Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, as we can see. And because of that, I would say, obviously, divorce still can occur if there's adultery, at least in the case of, sexual immorality. But it's not required in that case, and restoration can still happen. But here we go. Here's principle number 9. Put it up on the screen. Are you the cause of an unjustified divorce? Stay single or be reconciled. Many of you may be watching are in this situation. You divorced and it wasn't justified.
Okay, so the issue with Mike's principle here is twofold. First, I don't think it matters who the cause of the unjustified divorce was. Matthew 5:32, the second half of that, says if a man marries a divorced woman, he commits adultery. It doesn't matter if her divorce was her fault or not. Second, I don't think there are any exceptions that permit remarriage while a prior valid spouse is alive. So therefore, if someone is divorced from a valid marriage, they should stay single or be reconciled to their valid spouse. Who or what caused the divorce does not allow for remarriage.
And your options are stay single, which means you can't start a relationship with somebody else, and or be reconciled. In fact, that's the preference. Go be reconciled. Is it possible to be reconciled? There will be other exceptions, but that's the general rule. That's not to say that if you didn't cause the divorce, you're automatically free, but that's the instruction to the one who caused it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 12 through 16, Paul offers an exception Jesus never talked about, and it is very influential on my understanding of when someone can get a divorce and how to expand those exceptions to appropriate situations.
Okay, now note that Mike says Paul has an exception in 1 Corinthians 7:15 that Jesus does not give. Now, we have Jesus speaking on divorce and remarriage in 4 places. He never says what Mike claims Paul says. Also, you see in verse 15 where Mike gets this additional exception, that he's making an inference from the text. Paul never explicitly says the abandoned spouse can remarry. So Mike is claiming there is an allowance to remarry that Jesus never gives, but that Paul gives in one text by a mere implication. Not only that, but this implication appears to be against the context, since neither the Corinthians nor Paul are looking for remarriage. The Corinthians think celibacy is required for the Christian life. Paul thinks celibacy is preferable for the Christian life, but not required. Preferable. Okay, and so that's how we should think about it. Celibacy is preferable, but not required. But here's the point. Neither of them are looking for allowances to remarry. So it's odd to think Paul is implying it in verse 15.
Verse 12, let's look at it now. Verse 12, it says here, to the rest I say. Now, he talked to Christian husbands married to Christian wives and all that, but now he says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord.
Okay, so this phrase, to the rest, is not referring to a different, demographic group. It's not believers married to unbelievers. We're not switching demographic groups. It's Paul saying that what he is about to say is not a paraphrase of what Jesus taught. If he didn't say to the rest, his readers would think he's continuing to paraphrase Jesus. Paul is putting a clear bookend on that. So then what Paul is about to do is to respond to some Corinthian questions, and now the questions have to do with believer-unbeliever marriages. But that does not mean that Paul is claiming Jesus' teaching only applied to believer-believer marriages, right? So let me provide an example, and hopefully this will make it some sense. Okay, so if you came across an email from me and I said, hey, Joey, thanks for your email. To respond to your questions, my Christian mentor said, friends are really valuable. But to the rest of your question, my mentor didn't speak to it, but I would say you should continue your friendship with your friends who are atheists, since God can bless those relationships. Okay, so now when I said in this fake email, when I said my mentor said friends are really valuable, that meant all friends, not just my non-atheist friends. The fact that I answered a specific question about atheist friends later that my mentor didn't speak to does not mean my mentor's general statement doesn't cover Christian atheist friendships. Okay, so similarly, just because verses 12 and following answer a question about believer-unbeliever marriages does not mean verses 10 and 11 do not cover those same marriages. If we're going to say that Jesus' teaching was only for believer marriages, we would have to believe the Pharisees he was speaking to were believers, because he was clearly telling them, this is what you're supposed to be doing.
And all that means is that he has no teaching from Jesus directly on this, but he still feels he can weigh in on it as an anointed apostle. And he says that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, look at this, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Or for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Let's walk through this now. And as we understand this exception, I think it gives us a much fuller understanding of the topic. And it is my personal view that when you look at all of what Scripture says about any topic, you get this really full orb teaching that applies to the complexity of life. And here, this is part of that orbing, the full orbification that we need when we approach the topic of marriage and divorce. So verses 12 through 16, it basically says, look, here you're in a marriage where one of you is an unbeliever. The Christian, in principle, is to stay committed unless the unbelieving spouse gets a divorce or is, wanting that divorce. They're choosing to divorce. It was possible back in the day, as I said earlier, for one spouse to just unilaterally just leave without the consent of the other or to kick them out. That was possible. I'm sure they could try to argue against it and all that stuff, but it could happen. So which means this is about what to do generally just when one spouse is like, I'm out of here, I'm out. The question I want to ask, though, is this: why is everything different when it's an unbeliever who's not willing to stay with you? I mean, if you took Jesus's word as a strict, hard rule and you didn't think there were any exceptions, even if you thought the Matthew sexual immorality exception was there, but there were no other exceptions, that you can't even think of a situation in life where, okay, that's an exception, then Paul can't say what he's saying here.
Okay, I appreciate Mike's forthrightness here. He's totally right. If Jesus' teaching was the whole teaching on this subject, a person cannot remarry after abandonment. Now, if you look at Matthew 5:31-32, Matthew 19, 3 through 12, Mark 10, 2 through 12, and Luke 16, 18, what would Jesus' audience have thought? They would have thought this rule applies to all marriages, regardless of whether one or the other was an unbeliever. It's rooted in creation. Jesus is telling it to the Pharisees, who Jesus clearly teaches are not saved. So if there's a second exception in 1 Corinthians 7:15, does that mean Jesus, mistaught his audience in the Gospels? Of course, we can't make that conclusion. Additionally, this is a two-tiered rule. It creates a marriage stratification of higher and lesser marriages. But that's nowhere stated in the Bible. Our ordinary rules of interpretation are designed to prevent us from taking a phrase like "to the rest" to create a complex theory of marriage stratification of higher or lesser marriages, where if it's a lesser marriage, now a new exception kind of kicks in, and then you can take your marriage from a higher marriage to a lower marriage, depending on the conduct of your spouse. So my spouse is now acting like an unbeliever, so now we can relegate down, we can take the marriage down, like, bring it in the elevator and take it down one level, and now we have another exception for abandonment. Now, you can't do all of that from the phrase "to the rest." That's just not a good way of interpreting the Scriptures.
But for some reason, he says, if it's an unbeliever and they want to leave you, that's an exception to the general rule of keeping marriages together. And the question is, why an unbeliever? What's unique about an unbeliever? How does this make sense? And there are a couple options, possible principles, and I'm going to go with the second one, but I'll share the first one with you. One is, and some people think this, that a marriage to an unbeliever is just like inherently less binding than a marriage to a Christian. This is problematic for a couple reasons. For one, Jesus shows that marriage starts in the garden, right? And it's part of God's creation, and it's a thing with mankind. It's not a thing with believers. It's just something about humans that God has made us so that to become one flesh. In no place do we see that non-believers being married to non-believers is less binding, or like, can two non-believers get divorced more easily? Is that the rule? No, this is definitely not the case.
Okay, so I agree with Mike that all marriages are equally binding. But that also means when Jesus taught against divorce and did not include an exception for abandonment, Jesus was teaching about all marriages, not just those about believers.
This just doesn't work. And the second possible principle that we're getting is that a person who's beyond the influence of the gospel or church discipline, who is unwilling to continue in a marriage with a believer, that's an exception. And this principle, to me, this seems to be the rule that Paul is actually laying out. He's like, hey, earlier on, if you're a Christian, stay married. And if you separate, get back together. This is the general rule. There's an exception. Jesus talked about sexual immorality. But what if one of the spouses, one of them leaves and they won't listen to Jesus, and they won't listen to Paul, and they won't listen to the church? Well, they're an unbeliever. And so if they're leaving and there's no hope of recovery because of the situation of them not listening to Christ or the church, then it's an exception. You're not bound to that marriage anymore.
Mike's argument here is if one spouse is obstinate about not reconciling, the other spouse should be able to be free to be able to remarry. But Jesus didn't teach that. Mike already agreed Jesus did not teach that. Paul doesn't teach that either. Okay, so notice Mike says the abandoned spouse is, quote, not bound to the marriage anymore. Okay, Mike's use of the word bound here is actually kind of a problem. So the word bound is a technical term when it comes to marriage. Paul says a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. He says that, he writes that in Romans chapter 7 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. Bound is a technical term for marriage. But the Greek word for bound is not used in 1 Corinthians 7:15. It's not the word used in 1 Corinthians 7:15. Rather, Paul is teaching the abandoned spouse is not enslaved. It's a different Greek word. That does matter. Someone who is not enslaved has been freed. And what is the abandoned spouse freed from? They're freed from the encumbrances of that marriage. That marriage placed an encumbrance on them. They made it harder for them to serve God. So now they are free to serve God without that encumbrance of that likely difficult marriage. So that's what the Corinthians want to do anyway. That's the freedom that they want. Paul is saying, yes, the freedom you want to be able to serve God without this marriage, here's a case where you have that freedom that you're looking for. They're not thinking about the freedom to remarry. They're thinking about the freedom to serve God. And that's the freedom Paul is referring to when he says that in such a case, the believer is not enslaved. Mike says not enslaved means not bound. I say not enslaved means not encumbered. So Mike says not enslaved means free to remarry. I say not enslaved means free to serve God. So how do we determine which interpretation is correct, right? We have Mike's take and we have my take. Okay, how do we know which one? Well, you find out from the context. In verse 21, which is still in the to the married section of Paul's writing, Paul writes this: were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. This is the only other place where Paul speaks about slavery in this chapter. So he speaks about slavery in verse 15. He makes an allusion to slavery, not enslaved. He makes an allusion in verse 21. So we should think there's an analogy going on here. These two things, it should help us understand the two texts. So it's an analogy to what he was saying before in verse 15. So just as the bondservant should get free if he can, so that he can serve God better, so a believer should consider himself free to serve God if an unbeliever abandons him. So not enslaved is about freedom to serve God, not freedom to get encumbered with another marriage.
So if they do get a divorce, here's a new question: can they get married to someone else? If you're in this situation, does this not enslaved? I'll put it up again here for you. Does this phrase by Paul, this brother or sister's not enslaved, does that mean that they can marry a new person? They can marry someone other than their original spouse? So is it allowing not only divorce, but also remarriage is the question. Now, some people are against this. They're against this. And it has to do with the phrase not enslaved. What does it mean? And so let me make the case against remarriage here, and then I'll build the case for it so I can bring you along in the debate. Again, this is the exhausting long video, I know. The short video will come eventually, and maybe that's what you want to wait for. um, but I think that some of us need to know these debates, and we need to know the right answers and hear them thoughtfully. So again, there's a video map there, so you can bounce around below the screen here. There's in the description, so you can bounce around to the spots you need the most. But here's the debate on what not enslaved means in 1 Corinthians 7:15, and does it allow you to get remarried if your unbelieving partner wants to leave? So those against my view that it lets you get remarried, they say the phrase not in bondage or not enslaved, that phrase could just be referring to not being bound to the spouse and therefore being able to divorce, but not permission to marry someone else. So it's like it's a very specialized use of not bound.
Okay, so just to be clear, that's not what I'm saying. I am saying Paul is not speaking about the marriage bond at all when he says not enslaved. The marriage bond is until death. Not enslaved is referring to the practical encumbrances of continuing the life together with the unbelieving spouse. Mike's going to object to a different argument that isn't the one I'm making, just so we're clear on that.
But this is unlikely, right? If unilateral divorce is a thing, then that means, which it was in Roman times. So what that means is that they're being given permission to let the person leave, but you can't stop them anyways. Like if your spouse left you in ancient Rome, you couldn't stop them. It wasn't like with the Jewish man in Palestine, in ancient Israel, where the guy could say, I refuse to give you a divorce certificate. And the wife's like, but I just want to leave. And he's like, no, I refuse. A woman, in the Roman culture could just leave and he had no control over it. So then it means that you're not in bondage, means like you have permission to not keep them there when you couldn't keep them there anyways. It just doesn't make any sense. It actually turns the phrase not enslaved into like a nonsense thing that has no impact.
Okay, so Mike here says there's nothing for the believer to do if the unbeliever abandons, since the believer can't stop them anyway. So therefore, not enslaved must mean not bound, because otherwise there's no change in conduct from the believer that flows from the phrase not enslaved. But Mike is incorrect here. There is a verb in verse 15. The verse starts with, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. Let it be so. The rest of the verse supports the reason for the command, let it be so. So there is something that the believer is commanded to do on the basis of being not enslaved after abandonment. The believer is to let it be so. So Mike is claiming that they have no choice but to let it be so. Apparently, though, Paul wants to tell them to let it be so. That implies that they had some option besides letting it be so. They could have made the abandonment difficult. What about the kids, the finances, the family, the friends, other forms of pressure that they could use? When two people have their lives integrated together and then they want to deintegrate, that integration gives each spouse the option to put pressure to make deintegration difficult. So Paul is saying, don't use pressure. So Paul is not saying, oh, you can't use persuasion. You can try to use persuasion. He doesn't say don't use persuasion to try to keep the marriage together. But if they want to leave, don't use coercion. Don't use pressure. Christians are people of peace, not people of coercion. That seems to be Paul's message here. So not enslaved does have a meaning. It's also part of God has called you to peace. Peace as opposed to coercion and a bunch of, using a bunch of pressure and leverage on the person to try to get them to stay. Paul's saying, don't do that. If they're going to leave, let it be so.
On the people. Another argument that when Paul says the believer is not enslaved or not bound, that this does not free them for remarriage is a Greek argument. So it has to do with the word Paul uses here in this text. He says not enslaved, and that is doulao is the root, the lexical form of the word doulao, which is to be enslaved. That's why we use that strong word enslaved here, like in the ESV. But Paul, usually when he's talking about marriage and separation or divorce and remarriage, he uses the word deo, or the root word deo, and different uses of that word. So this at first caught me off, right? Because I went, and I check and I go, yeah. Paul does usually say deo for marriage and divorce. He uses that in that context. But here he says doulao, which is a much stronger word. And he says they're not enslaved. So the problem is that's a neat observation, but the application of the observation is unjustified. The application is what? What does it mean then? It just means they're not enslaved to what pursue restoration of the marriage.
Okay, so I appreciate Mike's mentioning of the Greek word difference and how when he first researched it, he's like, oh, there's something to this. But then he kind of reverted back to the view that he's giving here in the video. But he's questioning what the Greek word difference changes with regards to the meaning of the verse. And what Paul means here is just as a literal slave is free to better serve God once he is freed from slavery, so a believer is free to better serve God once he is freed from living with their unbelieving spouse. But the best way to see this is to see the one other place in the chapter where Paul refers to slavery, which is in verse 21, where the slave who is freed is now able to serve God better with his freedom. So Mike here makes the claim that the only argument in favor of viewing not enslaved in a way similar to how I view it, the only argument in my favor is the Greek word difference. And he says, well, the Greek word difference, that's like not sufficient to do it. And he may very well have not heard the other argument, but there's actually two arguments. The first argument is the Greek word difference, yes, which I do think is a big deal in this case. But the other argument is the context, that it actually goes against the context to take Mike's view because of what verse 21 says about the bondservant being freed and now able to serve God better. So I would say you have a Greek kind of argument. You know, it's a different Greek word. This doesn't seem to be talking about not bound. But you also have this other argument with regards to verse 21, where it's talking about slavery again. And that's like six verses later. It's very much in the context. It's very much looks like an analogy back to verse 15. And then you have some other problems, right? So like the whole 1 Corinthians chapter 7, nobody's looking for remarriage. Why would Paul think that's what they would imagine he's implying when Paul knows they're not even considering remarriage? That's not on their radar at all. So that's kind of odd. Also, we have one verse using the wrong word for bound. There's just way too many problems with then opening the floodgates. And also, it also requires you to read the phrase to the rest, to narrow Jesus' words to believer marriages when the text from the Gospels does not present that way. There's no way the audience would have thought that. This is 1 Corinthians 7:15 is the weakest part of their argument because there's so much going against this idea of an implied ability to remarry, permissibility to remarry from the phrase not enslaved and from the phrase to the rest. It's just problems all over the place.
They're not enslaved to, they can't keep them there because they can unilaterally divorce. So that's not even the thing. So all of a sudden, Paul's phrase not enslaved means almost nothing. It means almost nothing. So here's some things against that view. Reasons.
It would mean a lot to the Corinthians because they want to be free. So yeah, it means nothing to somebody who wants to remarry, but it means a lot to the Corinthians who are like, oh yes, I can be free now and I can serve God better. I don't have to pressure them to stay because maybe the pressure would work. Maybe the pressure would work and would keep the unbeliever there. And the believer doesn't really want them to stay, but they feel like maybe morally obligated to have them stay. And they don't really want to even do that. And so it'd be a sense of relief. Oh, I can let them go. I don't have to pressure them to stay and I can serve God, which is all I really want to do here. So yeah, it means a lot to the Corinthians, but no, it doesn't mean a lot to people who want to remarry today. Yeah, I agree. In that case, it doesn't mean a lot, but nobody in this particular chapter is thinking about that.
This is why I think when Paul says the brother or sister is not enslaved, it means that they can get married to whoever else they want, as long as they're believers. That's the rule for Christians, right? Doulao is used, according to Wayne Grudem, and I have his work linked below as well. Doulao is used in some extra biblical text to refer to divorce. So you can't just say that doulao doesn't have in its range of use the issue of divorce, because it does, at least in some texts in ancient Greek, though it's not in scripture in that way, but they're still speaking Greek. They're not speaking scripture Greek, like they can only use the words the way they're used, in the Old Testament or something.
Perhaps there's some Greek manuscript or whatever that Mike is alluding to that uses this Greek word to refer to divorce. Now, my guess is, I don't know, but my guess is they're talking about manuscripts about release of slaves. Those are called manumissions. And so that's a release of a slave. And people try to remark about how similar release of a slave is to a divorce. And they try to make it sound like it's kind of the same thing. But they're not the same thing. In fact, we know from the Talmud that if somebody had just written that you're not enslaved, that would not make them divorced. I've read 25 books on this subject. The argument I have heard was that a manumission was very similar to a divorce certificate. And I would say that they're not similar at all. So anyway.
Also, against that view is the strangeness of the view, right? So now you're allowed to violate your vows and your obligations to take care of and love and provide for that person. You're continually allowed to violate those, that you're allowed to do, but you're still obligated to the marriage. I don't understand this category
Okay, so the violation of the vows is by the abandoner, not the abandoned. So this objection just doesn't hold up.
of it's okay to be divorced, but you don't have to get back together. It's like not necessary to even try. That doesn't really make sense. This category is unheard of into Jews and Romans. They never would have thought.
Okay, it's not that you're not supposed to try. You can try to use persuasion. It's that you're not supposed to use pressure. It's what are the appropriate means when you try to keep it together. And the appropriate means would be persuasion, not coercion. That's Paul's point.
Thought something like this existed. So yeah, that's weird. Another strike against the no remarriage view in 1 Corinthians 7:15 is that the ruling means nothing, because saying you're not enslaved under that terminology with that interpretation, it doesn't change anything because there was unilateral divorce. Another strike against this is
It doesn't not mean anything. It means a lot to Corinthians who want to be able to serve God. So that doesn't work.
the meaning doulao. Okay, deo is what you would maybe you'd expect Paul to write. The believer is not deo; they're not bound to the marriage anymore. Now they're free to remarry. That's what Paul talks about in Romans and in later on in 1 Corinthians 7 when he says that if a woman's husband dies, she's not bound. She's not deo. Okay, that's true, but here's the thing: doulao is a stronger version of binding, right? Deo is like you're bound, you're attached to one another, like contractually. But doulao is an even stronger thing. He's not only saying you're not deo, he's saying you're not doulao, you're not enslaved. In other words, the proponents of the no remarriage view in 1 Corinthians 7:15 are effectively saying you're not enslaved, but you're still bound. And that's their understanding, their handling of the Greek. I don't think this fits with just a common sense view of 1 Corinthians 7. If you're not enslaved, what are you? Bound? Hey, mom, good news. I'm not enslaved anymore. Oh, that's great. So you're still bound, right? Like, nobody would think this. It's natural to say, if you're not enslaved, what are you? You know it. Free. You are free. If the brother's not enslaved, if the sister's not enslaved, then she's free. From what? From the marriage. That's what she's free from. And therefore, free to marry another. In Jewish and Roman divorce certificates, the concept of being free from your spouse, freedom from them, means that you're free to marry another. It always means that. In Paul, it means that as well. Here and in 1 Corinthians and in Romans 7, he uses the concept of free from your spouse, meaning that you're free to marry another. I think that any ambiguity about doulao and deo should be solved by how the original audience would hear it. And I don't think any original audience would hear and go, well, you're not enslaved, but you're still bound. Like, I don't think anybody would think that.
If we're going to go with the original audience, we'd go with the original audience to whom Jesus was speaking, and they would have not thought that Jesus' words only were for believer marriages. And the original audience here in 1 Corinthians 7 isn't looking for remarriage. They wouldn't be looking for an implication to be able to remarry from 1 Corinthians 7:15. But I agree with Mike that enslaved is stronger than bound. But that doesn't actually help Mike, because that means Paul is calling marriage slavery. If you take Mike's viewpoint, does Paul really believe husbands are slaves to their wives? Okay, so this is all more reason to not interpret not enslaved to mean no longer married. The freedom is freedom to serve God. So he talked about, if you're not enslaved, where are you? What are you guys? Well, you're free. Okay, free to what? Free to serve God. That's what the Corinthians are looking for. Again, no one's looking for remarriage.
Craig Keener points out that Jewish and Roman divorce certificates actually use the phrase free to simply mean free to marry another. In his book, which is linked below, Keener says the following, I'll quote it to you. The ancient Jewish marriage contracts we have found agree. In the context of divorce, free meant precisely that a woman was free to remarry, and meant nothing else than this. If Paul meant that remarriage was not permitted, he said precisely the opposite of what he meant. No first century reader would have derived the meaning that some modern scholars have read into Paul's words, perhaps because no first century reader felt that Jesus's general teaching was meant to apply to every specific case.
Okay, so I've read Keener's book, and the problem with Keener's quote is that the early church did not agree with that interpretation. Also, he is talking about Jewish divorce certificates, but we already know this is referring to permission under Roman law to auto divorce by separating. And the other thing here that's important to understand is that Jesus rejects the idea that the certificate grants permission to remarry. There's a lot of this that happens in scholarship land. They will take some certificates, read the certificates, say, this is the prevailing practice, and then they will conform Paul and Jesus' words to the prevailing practice. But Jesus and Paul do not conform to the prevailing practice. They have a different practice. That's why the disciples were shocked in Matthew chapter 19. So Jesus calls those remarriages adultery regardless of what the paperwork said and the phrases in the paperwork. So now I agree not enslaved means the abandoned spouse is now free. The question is free to do what? Free to remarry, which neither Paul nor the Corinthians wanted, that 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11 prohibit, and that Jesus prohibited 4 times in the Gospels, or free to serve God, which is what the Corinthians and Paul wanted and what Paul alludes to in 1 Corinthians 7, 21, the only other text in the chapter that talks about slavery.
That's page 61 in his book, And Marries Another. And I think that that's a really strong point against the no remarriage view. There's also no mention of staying unmarried, right? In verse 11, he says, hey, if you're a Christian and you leave your spouse, just stay unmarried or get remarried. But here, he doesn't qualify in his instructions to the believer who has an unbeliever who wants to depart. He doesn't say, and stay unmarried.
Okay, that's because he already said it in verses 10 and 11. So if you start with the premise that in verses 10 and 11, Paul says, I'm paraphrasing Jesus here. If you're divorced, stay single or go back to your spouse. And that if you understand that to mean that's referring to all marriage situations. And then further, if you read verses 12 and following, as Paul saying, now let me answer a couple of kind of niche questions you guys asked me that Jesus never had occasion to respond to. And so Paul is answering those questions. And then when he gets down to verse 15, he says, listen, if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever abandons you, you're not enslaved, you're at peace, go ahead, serve God. Let it be so. That's fine. You do what you want to do, which is serve God. If you understand it, the text that way, you would not think, oh, Paul should then be repeating his statement from verses 10 and 11 not to remarry. Paul doesn't need to repeat it. He already said it. So Mike's saying here, well, Paul didn't repeat it, so he must not mean it in this particular circumstance. That just assumes that verses 10 and 11 don't apply to all marriages. And the only way you can assume that is by using the phrase to the rest in verse 12. I mean, there's a lot of this whole theory that Mike uses that's typical in conservative evangelicalism that rests on those 3 words, to the rest. And you have to ask yourself, you look at the verses yourself, ask yourself, is that a reasonable way to understand the phrase to the rest? To be dividing verses 10 and 11 to believer-believer marriages, verses 12 and following to believer-unbeliever marriages, and further to narrow what Jesus said in the Gospels to only believer-believer marriages. Can you hang all that on the phrase to the rest? Does to the rest say that? It does not say that.
So I think that unless he says it, then we would assume the other is true. In some Jewish texts, actually, divorce was likened to emancipation from slavery because of the similar wording and procedure for both. And this is important because the argument against remarriage is like saying, hey, the word enslaved doesn't relate to marriage. So this isn't really about being separated from your marriage obligations from that person. But in Jewish thinking, marriage and slavery were conceptually related. Now, this doesn't mean they thought marriage was slavery. Okay, that's not what they're saying. They didn't have, like, we get triggered by all these types of terms in our culture, so we don't really think sometimes even clearly about them. They felt fine connecting the two. And you can read about that in Instrom Brewer's book. He has tons of really interesting insights about that kind of thing.
So I've read David Instone Brewer's book as well. He's a smart guy. I disagree with his conclusions, but he has some interesting insights in his book. So Mike is equating, you get this from David Instone Brewer, he's equating manumission documents for freed slaves with divorce certificates that gave legal civil permission for remarriage. But here's why that doesn't work. If a divorce certificate only said you are free from slavery, it would be an invalid divorce. The divorce certificates had to say you are free to marry another man, right? Part of this is only the man can give the woman a certificate of divorce. So she's never giving him a certificate of divorce. That's not, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 24 in verse 1, it's gendered. The man gives the wife a certificate of divorce, not the other way around. So, and it had to say, according to the Talmud, and all of the divorce certificates say this, you are free to marry another man. So the manumission document actually argues against Mike's position, because if you took Paul's exact wording here, not enslaved, and put it on the divorce certificate, that would be an invalid divorce. If we were to use Mike's line of reasoning that Paul is speaking in legal certificate language, and that tells us what Paul means, then the fact that Paul does not say free to marry another means Paul is not saying the marriage is over.
So, not under bondage, in the context of chapter 7, or not enslaved, it seems to refer to not being bound to the marriage. This we see in other places. In chapter 7, verse 27. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So bound and free. The concept of bound and free, though the words are not necessarily doulao, it's deo there, but the idea of freedom is connected to remarriage.
Okay, so first, the passage he's referring to there is about betrothal, not marriage. So, and we'll talk about that. But second, he is just assuming the premise here that bound and enslaved mean the same thing. All the evidence shows that they do not mean the same thing. So this argument just doesn't work.
Or being at least able to marry another. In verse 39, we get the same thing. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord.
Okay, again, he is assuming bound and enslaved mean the same thing, but they do not.
That's actually the way it was written in the certificates, the Jewish ones. They said you're free to marry whoever you want as long as they're Jewish. That's what they.
All right, so Mike is right here. The divorce certificates would say you are free to marry another. That language is required, or else the divorce is invalid. That's why saying not enslaved wouldn't be technical language that means they're divorced. So, and they were sticklers about needing the language free to marry another. Okay, so they had that in the Talmud, long portions about how divorces were invalid unless they explicitly said she was free to marry another. It had to have like that text, that terminology in there, or the divorce was viewed as invalid. So if the divorce certificate said not enslaved, it would have been seen as an invalid divorce,
they would say. And so contextually, it fits what Paul is saying. And then it leaves us with one question. Oh, I meant to put that on the screen for you guys. There it is. Now you've been able to read it very carefully. Sorry, you got a Bible. You can look it up. Why does Paul then use the more extreme word doulao instead of the more common for marriage and divorce, deo? Why does he use doulao? And I think this gets to the heart of the issue. Maybe because being bound to a marriage where somebody wants to reject you, wants to separate from you, and wants to cut off the marriage, somebody who will not listen to the church, who will not listen to Jesus, and who will not heed the instructions of God. Being bound to that kind of marriage is more like slavery than the normal marriage relationship.
Okay, so here I agree with Mike. I think Paul is imagining a difficult relationship that ends in abandonment. Being free from the daily encumbrance of that relationship is a real freedom, even if it doesn't permit remarriage. So when Mike earlier said that not enslaved doesn't mean anything unless it's freedom to remarry, he wasn't thinking about the point he raises here. The abandoned spouse who no longer has to deal with the frustrations and difficulties of this relationship will probably feel great relief once they're abandoned. So that's a kind of freedom, but also it means they can do more of what their heart desires, which is to serve God, not by being encumbered by this, challenging relationship. So not enslaved does mean something profound for the person, even if it doesn't permit remarriage.
And Paul's like, I'm not calling you to that situation. God's not calling you to that situation where you are enslaved ultimately to your spouse. That is not the calling. That, I think, is why he's using doulao, the stronger word enslaved, as opposed to deo. So there's a major point here. I'm saying remarriage, for a second exception that Jesus never mentioned, is morally permissible based on the interpretation I've just given in 1 Corinthians 7. You can remarry when you have this obstinate person who doesn't want to be with you, and they're not subject to Jesus and the church.
Okay, so I would say no remarriages are permissible or valid when a prior valid spouse is living. Neither adultery nor abandonment end the first marriage, even if a government-approved divorce is received. So God views the spouses as still married despite the divorce, so that any remarriage is just adultery against the prior valid spouse.
So let's talk a little bit about this additional exception, because this affects us in a lot of ways. First off, we'll just point out that in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 7, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but Paul introduces this as not the Lord, but I. Verse 12, there it is. To the rest I say, not I, or I, not the Lord. Then he goes on to say, like, yeah, you can have a divorce and you're free to remarry in this scenario. Now, here's what's really interesting. This is important, right? Paul offers an instruction to apply to the lives of Christians, but it's a scenario Jesus never dealt with at all. And Paul felt like he had the ability to read an additional exception because he, it seems, assumed that Jesus's strict rule wasn't meant to apply to every conceivable scenario.
I disagree that Jesus' rule only applies to believer marriages. Again, he taught it to the Pharisees who were not believers. Paul is not creating a new exception to expand what Jesus taught. I don't think Mike intends to do this, but in fact, what Mike is doing is making Paul contradict Jesus. Paul doesn't do that, though. Instead, Paul says, Jesus taught, don't divorce. If you do, don't remarry. Next, Paul says, don't use pressure or coercion to make it hard for an unbeliever to separate, but rather view it as an opportunity to be free to serve God unencumbered by the difficulties created by the daily life in that relationship.
That is huge. He did not see Jesus' teaching as applicable directly to the scenario in hand. It required another decision from another source. This means, guys, that the strict view of Jesus on marriage doesn't actually work. The strictest view applies Jesus's comments on marriage to any and all circumstances with no qualifications, right? But Paul doesn't even do this. He saw a circumstance that was unique and it was not addressed by the general rule Jesus gave. And so he brings an instruction under the inspiration of the Spirit for the church.
Okay, that's a lot of words to say Paul contradicted Jesus. If you just take Jesus' teaching at face value, you cannot remarry after abandonment.
Here's the point. Hear me here, because this is a big deal. And it took me a long time to get to this point. I mean, in my own studies, in my own research and thought and prayer on this stuff. If there's a situation that is unique, that is just unique, it's just strange and weird, like this one, we can have it implicit permission to approach it without the strictest view on marriage that some take. We can say, Jesus's rule is the general rule, but this situation seems different, so we need to consider it individually.
Okay, this effectively makes Jesus' teaching subject to the judgment of the church, right? It puts the leaders of your church ahead of the text of scriptures. It relegates scripture to containing a general, like, kind of pro-marriage value or ethic, but not a rule, right? So the Bible becomes one of many factors under consideration when the final authority on whether or not divorce and remarriage is permissible, the final authority on that is not the Bible. According to what Mike just said here, the final authority of that are the church leaders. Once leaders decide a situation is sufficiently unique or sufficiently difficult, they can craft a rule based on their own judgment. That's fundamentally not evangelical. We do not hold that tradition or church authority is on par with Scripture. God's revelation comes before our tradition or our church authority.
I think this gives us real space for divorce, not only for the obstinate unbeliever who doesn't want to be married, but for things like abuse or other extreme and, life. We get weird, crazy situations that people are in that you're like, man, I don't think Jesus had that in mind when he was giving this rule. And I think this gives us space for those types of things. Okay.
All right, so Mike brings up abuse. So I have a whole video on that, but the bottom line is this: a spouse can retreat from an unsafe environment, and if their child needs safety, they can retreat with their child to secure this objective of being safe. So if a legal divorce is required to secure safety, suppose the spouse is going to be stalking and all this kind of stuff, and you just have to get away from them, and that for whatever reason requires a legal divorce, then that can be obtained as well in order to secure safety. People can retreat; they don't have to be subject to an unsafe environment. So in that case, the spouse who is retreating is not abandoning. And therefore isn't violating the scriptural command to not abandon. The abandoner would be the one who is compelling them to leave, which would be the one who's creating the unsafe environment. So we don't need to invent a whole new framework to set aside Jesus' teaching in order to reach the conclusion that somebody can retreat from an unsafe environment.
So here's some principles that we've gathered now. If an unbeliever, principle number 10, if an unbeliever wants, I don't know why I wrote it that way. If the unbeliever wants to leave the believer or just leaves them, the believer may allow it and be free to remarry. If they want to leave or just leaves them, they can allow it and be free to remarry.
So I disagree with that last portion. Neither the believer nor the unbeliever is free to remarry. If they remarry, it's adultery, as Jesus says 7 different times in the Gospels.
Can we assume that attempts at reconciliation are made? Of course we can, because you're a Christian. Can we assume that you're trying to take up your cross and follow Jesus, that you're turning the other cheek, you're forgiving, you're doing all those things? Yes, right? But if they want to leave, then you can come to this point. Then principle 11, Jesus's rule has exceptions not explicitly mentioned. Therefore, we can be open to new circumstances. That's huge. That is a really big deal. And I think that it's the whole teaching of Scripture on the topic. So let's ask a new question. The new question is this. Let's say that I'm a Christian and I'm married to a Christian. Is there any scenario where I can treat that Christian as a non-Christian? Or I'll put it this way. When can a Christian spouse be treated like a non-Christian and then covered by 1 Corinthians 7:15? And I think it can.
Okay, so next, so here Mike is making a pivot. The pivot I alluded to earlier. So he's going to use the phrase "to the rest" in verse 12 to narrow Jesus' teaching to just believer-believer marriages, even though that's indefensible. Then he's going to say Paul is referring to believer-unbeliever marriages in verses 12 and following, and says that the abandoned believer can remarry. This two-step is necessary to create the argument that Paul added an exception that allows remarriage. Otherwise, it's impossible to say Paul didn't contradict Jesus. Because if you don't do this to the rest thing, if you don't do that, and then use that phrase to mean that, to narrow Jesus to believer-believer marriages and Paul's 12 and following to believer-unbeliever marriages, if you don't do that, then when you get down to the abandonment thing, the argument's going to be, well, then you're saying Jesus and Paul are contradicting each other, which is impossible, and so therefore we have to narrow what Paul said to match what Jesus said. So in order to prevent that contradiction, once you get down to verse 15, they do this thing up in verse 12. They use the phrase "to the rest" to mean, Jesus was only speaking about believer-believer marriages. It's totally an indefensible position, but that's what they do. And then that way you can make 12 and following to not contradict, because that's a different kind of marriage. That's a believer-unbeliever marriage, different type of marriage. So that's the two-step that you have to do. And if they don't do that, then they make verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 7 to contradict, like Matthew 19:9, for example. All right, so next, Mike is going to apply this exception that was supposed to only apply to unbelievers abandoning. He's going to then apply it to believers abandoning by saying they're acting like unbelievers. Now, so here's the problem. If a believer can remarry after their believing spouse abandons them, and Jesus was teaching about believer-believer marriages, why didn't Jesus bring that up? To that, people will say the believer who abandoned wasn't a real believer. Okay, but Jesus taught that the persistent adulterer spouse was a believer, right? You have to understand, these people, they think that the exception clause allows the innocent party to adultery to divorce and remarry, right? So you have a husband and wife, they're married, the wife infidelity, and then the husband can remarry. And so now when you get to 1 Corinthians 7, they say, well, Jesus, when he gave that exception, was only referring to believer-believer marriages. Okay, and so then if you have a believer and you have an unbeliever, that's a different circumstance. It allows the believer to remarry after they're abandoned. And if you have a believer and a believer, and the believer abandons, you just treat the believer like they're an unbeliever. Okay, but then why didn't Jesus talk about that? Because Jesus talked about two believers, one of them committing adultery. Jesus couldn't imagine one of them abandoning. If you can imagine one of them committing adultery, they couldn't think that Jesus could imagine an abandonment believer. So that just doesn't really work. If Jesus was talking about believers married to other believers who are sometimes adulterers, then it would have been in the purview for Jesus to include believers married to other believers who sometimes abandon. Since Jesus did not make an exception for abandonment, there is no exception to remarry for abandonment. Their whole theory kind of falls apart when you say, okay, then how come the abandonment for the believer marriage was not in the exception clause for Jesus? And there's no good answer to that.
And happen, and I'm going to build a case for it now. So can the unbeliever situation be properly applied to other situations, like a believer who abandons their spouse or is unwilling to stay married? And there's a few things I'll point out here. One is going to be Dr. Wayne Grudem. Wayne Grudem recently changed his stance on divorce and remarriage, and he wrote about it in a paper called, I'm trying to remember the name of the paper. I have it linked below, but it's something like Exceptions, Why I Now Believe There's More Than Two, about marriage and divorce. It's something like that, man. Anyway, it's linked below. You guys can check it out. The exact title escapes me. But it gets into a lot of Greek stuff, and I'll let you read his paper. I'll say this, that summaries of his paper can actually miss some of the nuance he's actually trying to get at. And when I first heard summaries of it, I thought, nah, that sounds kind of weak. But as you read the paper more carefully and thoughtfully, you realize it's more careful and thoughtful. Basically, it goes like this. The phrase in 1 Corinthians 7:15, and I'm going to put it on the screen for you. In such cases, this is a Greek phrase, and this might sound like a little deal to people, but it's made thoughtfully. Is that last word cases is plural. In such cases, and basically, I'm going to try to summarize as best I can Dr. Grudem's work here. He says, if Paul wrote in such a case, it would mean only in this exact circumstances the brother is not enslaved. In the exact circumstance of an unbeliever who's going to separate, then you're not enslaved. You can get remarried, whatever. But Paul wrote in such cases, and that is a different Greek phrase that has specific meaning when you use the plural there. And what it means is that he's open to extending this instruction to things that are like this. Other situations that you say, yeah, this is kind of like that, right? These are exceptional circumstances. Now, he builds this case pretty strongly. He surveys hundreds of years of literature to find every time that this exact phrase in such cases is used in the Greek, and he shows, that it's a category. It's not just an instance. It's not just when an unbeliever leaves. It's rather, or things like that. So my conservative view of it is this. I would not use Wayne Grudem's case to allow for more exceptions by itself. I think it's not enough information by itself. I do, however, think that I have several reasons I'm about to share with you on why you can extend other exceptions into, proper justification for divorce. And I think that Wayne Grudem's case helps strengthen that. It adds weight to this case because what I'm about to share with you right now. And that is that there are clear teachings in the scripture that sometimes believers are to be treated as unbelievers. Whether they're genuine believers or not is irrelevant. They're at least proclaiming they're believers, and they're to be treated as if they are unbelievers. And
that's true.
If that's the case, then the 1 Corinthians 7 passage can be applied to a situation where both parties claim to be Christian, but one of them wants to depart, and the innocent party can be free from that marriage. And here's the circumstance where that's the case.
Okay, so I would agree that a believer can be treated as an unbeliever in certain circumstances he'll talk about. And that does then mean verse 15 can apply in that situation. I don't disagree with that. What I disagree with is that Paul is saying that when you apply verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 7, that what Paul means is you're not married to that person. Paul is not saying that. He's saying you're not enslaved, which means you're free from the encumbrance of that marriage, which means now you're free to be able to serve God. We see that in verse 21. That's what the Corinthians want to do in the first place. That's the freedom they're seeking. They're not seeking freedom to remarry. Nobody's looking for that. So I agree that, yes, verse 15 can apply to a believing spouse who abandons. Okay, but that does not then mean a person is not married. So that's where the real difference, I think, comes from.
Matthew chapter 18. Now, in Matthew 18, Jesus talks about a circumstance where a believer can be treated as an unbeliever. And we'll actually start in verse 15. He says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Step one. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. So seek reconciliation, confront them.
I just want to mention here, this is talking about if your brother sins against you. So this is not necessarily every time there's a problem, you have to follow Matthew 18. It's talking about you have a problem because your brother sinned against you.
But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So that now you bring others with you. You bring a friend, you bring your dad, you bring your brother, your sister, you bring their dad or something. You bring other people, use wisdom to try to confront them about the sin issues. These are obviously major sin issues. This isn't like they just hurt your feelings. Then verse 17, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. So then we get like local body discipline confronting going on. Hey, you've been abusing your wife and we're confronting you and we're going to bring this to you now. In that case, I would actually call the police in addition. But if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So this is a situation of church discipline where a person who is proclaiming they're a Christian, because they won't listen to Jesus and they won't listen to the church, they're to be treated as a non-Christian. Paul talks about this as well. In an effort to keep this video from becoming 18 hours long, I won't cover it in detail, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the entire chapter is about church discipline and treating a sinning unbeliever who will not repent, it's gross sin, it's serious sin, and he will not repent. You are now to treat him as a non-believer. Let me give you one more verse that strengthens.
Okay, let me just say, this is a great example of where Mike is just a good Bible teacher. He's on most subjects, I like him a lot. I like Mike on most subjects. On this particular subject with divorce and remarriage, I disagree. But I just wanted to highlight this because what you're seeing is, because of the nature of this reaction video, what you're seeing is the places where I disagree with Mike. And so you might think, oh, Mike's terrible. No, Mike's pretty good on a lot of subjects. He's really good. At the time of this recording, he's doing a bunch of cover-up culture exposés. I don't know what you want to call them, but he's doing great work on that kind of stuff.
Strengthens this case, and it ties it directly to marriage. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his house, he has denied the faith, and he's what? He's worse than an unbeliever. So here we have, if a guy's doing this and he won't say that the husband's starving and will not provide for his own family, and then the wife's like going to the church and like, hey, help me here. If he won't listen to her, to the body, he's to be treated as an unbeliever. That's the bottom line. So let me break this down, how this actually works in real life. Like, what do you do step by step? Okay, it goes like this. Step 1, you have a Christian spouse who wants a divorce. They claim they're Christian and they want to divorce you. Step 1, you deal with your own issues first. You get the plank out of your eye. You do Galatians 6:1. If anyone's caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, keeping watch on yourselves, lest you too be tempted. So you deal with yourself first. First thing you do is you deal with bitterness, anger, resentment, desire for harm or malice towards the other person. You deal with all that stuff between you and the Lord, and you can come you open and honest and repentant if you've been contributing sin into the situation. That's your first step. Step 2, you work with your spouse. You go to them. Hey, let's work on this. Hey, I want to offer forgiveness for this, but I need to see you making differences, making changes. I want to stay married. I want to stay together. And you try to work with your spouse. Step 3, it won't work. You bring in 1 or 2 others, Christians, to try to help bring the pressure of Christian commitment to them. If that doesn't work, you involve the local church. Step 4. If that doesn't work, leaders agree, he is to be, or she is to be treated as an unbeliever. And now 1 Corinthians 7:15 applies.
So Mike says you can divorce and remarry for infidelity. That's his view. So if Jesus was giving an exception for believer marriages for adultery, why wouldn't Jesus also be then giving the exception for believer marriages after abandonment? So I agree with him. You go through this process, but you go through this process whether it's adultery or abandonment. So the process here is the same. And then Mike would say you could divorce or remarry. But the question then is, why did Jesus only refer to adultery in the exception clause, if that's how this whole system works? And the reason why Jesus didn't refer to abandonment in the exception clause is because there is no exception for abandonment. They wanted to, in 1 Corinthians 7, they had to make it so that Paul and Jesus don't contradict. So they had to say, well, the way we make it not contradict is we say that Jesus is talking about these kinds of relationships, and Paul is talking about these kinds of relationships. So you have exception over here for these kinds, and you have a different exception over here. You have adultery over here and abandonment over here. And so that keeps them from contradicting each other. But then we want to then apply that abandonment exception back over here on the other side. So that you do that, and then people just don't notice. Wait a minute. The whole reason why you had to distinguish these two is because otherwise you'd have a contradiction. But now you're trying to take the abandonment exception from over here and bring it back over into the territory that Jesus was talking about. And so now that does create a contradiction. And so that's my whole point here by kind of walking through all this. So it's a lot of words. It takes actually a long time to even notice. Most people, I don't think, are even aware of this internal contradiction in this kind of complex system that they've got here. I mean, it's very thin assertions that not enslaved means not married, even though that goes against what the Greek says. That's not what you'd write on a certificate of divorce. It goes against the context of verse 21. Nobody is looking for remarriage. In 1 Corinthians 7, they're looking to be free to serve God, not free to remarry. It implies that marriage is slavery. If you say that not enslaved means not married, that means marriage is slavery. So there's just a ton of different problems. There's no way Jesus' audience would have thought he was talking about believer marriages. He roots it in creation, and he says this is the rule the Pharisees should be following, who are not believers. And at no place does Jesus narrow his teaching to saying just believers are supposed to follow the rules that he gives in those 4 places in the Gospels. It's Swiss cheese. This does not work. The exception for abandonment does not work. It is by far the weakest point in the case that conservative evangelicals make today for allowing divorce and remarriage. It is also the exception used most often to justify divorce and remarriage. And it also, I should mention this, is the springboard from which they say, oh, there must be a whole universe of exceptions because here's Paul coming in with another exception that Jesus didn't have because he was faced with a difficult circumstance. So that means we now as church leaders can find difficult circumstances and then make up new exceptions on the fly by using our judgment. And so that's being able to put the church leadership's judgment ahead of the text of Scripture. And that is just obviously not what Jesus meant in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, or Luke 16.
They're beyond Jesus' lordship, beyond the church's influence. Major attempts at reconciliation have been made. They want a divorce. They can divorce you, and you are now free to marry another. I think that's a consistent interpretation of Scripture. Does this conflict with 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11? If we look at those before, some would say there's a conflict I'm creating here. He says, to the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. No, actually here in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11, it's the husband and the wife who are being given instructions. But what if they don't listen? What if the wife who's separated won't listen? The husband who's leaving his wife won't listen? Well, then they can eventually be treated as an unbeliever and be covered by 7:15. What do you do if the local church won't help you? They won't do church discipline. They won't get involved or they won't listen. I think you do the best you can. You try to take those steps and you do the best you can. You walk with wisdom, get counsel, and you may still end up having to treat them as an unbeliever, depending on the scenario. How much time has to go by? I'm not going to answer that question. How much time has to go by before you could look at getting remarried or look at building another relationship? I don't know how to answer that question. Every situation is so different. So God give you wisdom. And what if you want to wait? What if they've left you, but you're like, I just want to stay single and wait, and I'm hoping for restoration? Then God bless you. That's a great thing. Go for it. You're not enslaved, though. That's your choice. You're not enslaved. It's a choice you're making. It's not being forced upon you. I just wouldn't put it as a requirement. So this leads us to principle 12 in our long list of principles, biblical principles. The rule for unbelievers can be applied to proclaimed believers if they can be biblically treated as unbelievers. This doesn't mean they are unbelievers. It means that we're allowed to treat them as such. I think this is good Bible study, in my opinion. So let me go.
Okay, so in evangelicalism, most remarriages are justified under 1 Corinthians 7:15. So there's a lot at stake, and it comes down to the meaning of not enslaved. So go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, get a copy of my book. I'll have a link to it in the description below. You can get it from Amazon.com. We will continue our series next time reacting to Mike Winger's teaching on divorce and remarriage.